It's easy to forget that in these challenging and uncertain times, companies need to continue their growth. To achieve that sustainably, it's not just often extra funding that's needed, but also a little extra experienced help and longer-term commitment from an investor. Finding such a combination may be another challenge. That's why here at Meet the Leader, I'm delighted to have the opportunity of interviewing the leader of an investment company who specifically says he's in it with you for the long run. Let's meet the founder and CEO of Parabellum Investments, Rami Cassis. Welcome, Rami.
Malcolm, thank you for having me on the show. It's nice to see you.
The coronavirus pandemic has raised the supply chain question to new heights. Many firms are talking about the importance of being less dependent on China, for example, perhaps seeking suppliers in Mexico instead. I know that you've recently commissioned some research on this. What were your findings?
The findings were that the overwhelming majority of respondents, at least in part, blame China for the outbreak of the pandemic. And the survey for us was instigated really because we need to be on the front foot in terms of consumer behavior, because that ultimately drives enterprise behavior.
Yeah.
So that was the primary reason why we instructed the survey. But so to come back to the results of the survey, so on average, 77% of respondents, we interviewed respondents in the UK, in Australia, and in the US. The follow-on point of that responsibility is that a lot of respondents, again in the areas of around 60%, slightly higher in Australia, felt that they felt sufficiently strong enough about this sense of responsibility that they would be prepared or would go out of their way to buy local products ahead of potentially less expensive Chinese goods. So it appears as though people have a sense that someone needs to stand up to the responsibilities associated with this outbreak, and they feel strongly enough about it in order to do something that may end up costing them financially. So people are prepared to vote with their wallets, effectively, is what the results were saying. Now, this doesn't need to be the end of globalization, but what I think is likely to happen is that there is certainly going to be a shift away from the old definition of globalization, and probably more focused on local or regional supply chain. Now, I very much hope that does not turn into a strong and fervent focus on nationalism. I don't think it needs to. If we can have globalization with slightly less reliance on China. China was or is the world's factory. I think there's now a realization that perhaps there needs to be a lesser reliance on the Chinese economy as a result of this. Now, a lot of, I think, regional economies will benefit. So Mexico is one, if you're in the US, or the rest of Latin America, so Argentina or Colombia. Certainly North Africa for Francophile countries, parts of Eastern Europe, I think will benefit. Certainly India for a lot of Asian countries, and possibly Vietnam and the Philippines. So there are a number of other top-class supply chain destinations that are viable beyond China. And I'm not remotely for a second saying this is the end of China. It certainly isn't.
No.
But I think it has opened a lot of governments and a lot of enterprises' eyes. Now, consumer behavior in all of this context will drive enterprise and companies' behavior. But I think this shift away from China has already begun. There have already been a number of firms that have announced the shift away from China into nearby economies or nearby other local destinations.
It was quite interesting that CIPS, which Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply, said recently in a survey that 43% of buyers in the UK who had sourced alternative suppliers during coronavirus are going to keep those extra suppliers on.
I'm not surprised. Even if what would have been interesting is also to find out whether or not that has cost implications, but most definitely, I think that's a trend that's likely to continue.
Yeah, I think it was the reliability outstripped the cost implications. Things like PPE, by the way, it was private personal protection and everything. Yeah.
Indeed, I think people realize that sometimes buying the cheapest could end up being a false economy.
Yes.
Because if you consider the useful life of an item, and for the case of simple equipment, but even machinery, if the maintenance costs are higher and the useful life of that equipment is shorter, it ends up costing you more in the longer term. So I think that's a consideration that has been often at the heart of any enterprise or any manufacturing facility, but I think it's now working its way to the consumer.
It's a whole life value, really, isn't it? Rather than
indeed, absolutely,
yeah. Okay. So, how at Parabellum Investments are you reacting to this research?
Well, for us, it's firstly, it's an interesting look at one of the things that we think is likely to happen in the coming years.
Yeah.
But it also means, in terms of our investment opportunities, and I would say we are strategically opportunistic in terms of our acquisition considerations. We are looking for deals and businesses in those typical nearshore and local destinations. So businesses in Latin America, enterprise. We've recently acquired a business in Turkey and Belgium called Advanco that has a track and trace solution which audits which audits effectively the movement of a product across an entire supply chain. So, for example, one could audit the manufacture of a mask or a product all the way through to its distribution. Advanco, as the case happens, is entirely focused on pharmaceutical drugs, and which works across a number of countries. So there we're potentially looking at something in India and also Australia. So we're looking at those destinations, at those countries where we feel there is likely to be an upsurge in growth over the coming years as they begin to take some of the market share away from China.
Yes, yeah. And of course, this complete change that we're having in the world, isn't it, of digital transformation?
Indeed. So I think that itself is going to change the way that we work. Yeah. But I think there is going to be a shift in terms of the world's production of goods and services, and China's loss is likely to be a number of other countries' gain.
Yeah. I think what also, just as an aside to that, has happened is that local suppliers who we were talking about there have maybe awoken to the fact that they need to be agile and have, stepped into the breach there, and it's good for them.
No, indeed. I think it's encouraged or given them the incentive to respond much more quickly.
Yes.
And to potentially gear up for production that they were not going to be ready for in the timeframes that they were asked to deliver it in.
Yeah. Now, here in the UK, we've been focused obviously on coronavirus, but we've been forgetting about that other big question that's hanging over us, Brexit.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, the three outcomes of Brexit: on-time exit with a deal, no deal, or extension. How do you think one of them would affect your investments and your future thinking?
Yeah, this has been clearly a question that's been on my mind for a number of years, given how long the Brexit saga has been ongoing. I think a negotiated Brexit deal is the nearest thing to a status quo that the UK would reasonably hope to achieve. So I think that scenario is not something that. I think that scenario in relative terms is not something that's going to require drastic action. A no deal scenario is the big unknown, and I think a no deal scenario, I think the worst case of a no deal scenario is that it drives, on the one hand, it drives isolationism. I know that isn't the purported claim of the UK government, who wish and want to be able to negotiate trade terms with a number of other countries. The reality is those trade deals are going to take many years to develop. Now,
yes.
of the 5 companies that Parabellum Investments is currently involved in, 2 are very strong British firms, and the third has a presence in the UK. So I think those, in the case of a no-deal Brexit, I think will likely be beneficiaries in as far as it will encourage a number of UK clients to probably buy more British. So in that scenario, I think I think within the realms of what's possible to address as a mitigation, I think that's an opportunity. But either way, what is undoubtedly going to happen is that I feel that irrespective of the terms of Brexit, there will be a number of European firms, many have in fact already begun to do this, who will establish a presence in the UK because they will not want to miss out on the UK market. There are 60 million consumers. The UK is still the world's fifth or sixth largest economy. Yeah. No one in Europe will want to miss out on the benefits of the UK market. So I expect to see a lot of European firms moving into the UK and setting up a presence in the UK, which will be good for the UK economy. Mm-hmm. And vice versa, I also expect a number of UK firms to develop a presence in Europe for the same reasons.
Yes.
So, look, I don't think either way, whether it's a no deal or a negotiated deal with a halfway in between kicking the can down the road, which in many ways is probably the worst of all three options, will have a catastrophic or cataclysmic consequences. I think, given what we've been through, the world has realized we're probably more resilient than we thought, and there are probably more things that we can do working from home than we thought were possible. So I like to think that life will go on and businesses will continue to thrive, but there will be disruptions, there will be complications in the case of a no-deal Brexit. And I expect that will drive a potentially very difficult year in 2021 for the UK. It really depends on how orderly or disorderly the separation is in terms of a deal.
Yeah, and if we get the triple whammy of a recession as well, it's going to need some very strong leadership, isn't it?
Yeah, well, it's going to need some. I think it's going to need sustained and consistent and meaningful investment by the government in supporting businesses. Mm-hmm. Because a lot of the government support, some of it has been tangible, but others have just been delaying payments. So offering a loan to an SME isn't necessarily helpful if they're no better off in 6 months.
Yes.
So yeah. There are important cash implications that I think the government needs to take into account.
Yeah.
And a disorderly Brexit or a no-deal Brexit will most definitely require continued government intervention in its fiscal policy.
Yeah, and another bit of news today in the UK is that when JRS, the Job Retention Scheme, finishes in August, or it sort of winds down, the supposedly millions of people that will then be made redundant, particularly in hospitality and other businesses. Yeah. There. Yeah, it's all a really interesting challenge. So how does Parabellum Investments manage the companies it invests in? I mean, are you a micromanager or a bit more hands-off? I notice you do say you are not what you may be called a grab and run investor.
Yes, so the asset strippers or the grab and runners is what
the vulture capitalist, you mean?
The vulture capitalist, yes. So and I'll start with that. The reason why we're not that is because we believe we go into a transaction on the basis and the belief that we can work together with a management team to develop the business. It isn't for a flip. It isn't for a trade. It isn't to put a whole range of people out of work in order to sell it on, a few months down the road. So we go into this with a concerted and detailed view at how the business works, how they go to market, the type of clients they have, and whether we are able to bring in additional revenue in light of our own existing contacts or other networks or knowledge of the sector for a whole range of reasons. In terms of my own management style, once things are on the road and progressing to plan, and usually it's the first 3 months that if any work is required to bring something, to put something back on its rails, it's the first 3 months. Mm-hmm. So putting aside the first 3 months where we are all very active, and especially me, I really manage by exception. I work with CEOs who I trust and have confidence in. As long as that trust and confidence is not breached irreparably, then the plan is to leave them to get on with it. And my role, as I said earlier, is very much to support them to achieve their objectives. So it is absolutely management by exception. I'm the furthest thing from a micromanager. And I think if one is to become a micromanager, then that reduces the role of the people you've put in place. I think if you're going to put people in place, you need to empower them to get on with it.
Yes, totally agree. It undermines, doesn't it? With the Meet the Leader program, I've been interviewing many CEOs with global operations who now have to manage remotely even more. So what's your approach to remote management or remote control? Do you have set virtual meetings? Do you drop in virtually unexpectedly, as some do? What's your approach and ethos to it?
I would never, firstly, drop in unexpectedly on someone, because I think that invokes mistrust. It implies that you have a suspicion that they're up to no good and that you should just turn up to keep them honest.
Yeah.
So if it was ever done to me, I would have found it offensive, and I would find it offensive to do as a CEO. It sounds a little bit old school, Malcolm, but actually my preference, whenever possible, is to try and make sure that I spend face-to-face time with people whenever possible. Now, that does require a lot of travel, and I won't share with you my air miles balance because it's embarrassing.
Yeah.
But so, look, I don't have a policy. In as far as possible, I want to make sure that I see all of the teams within reason as regularly as possible, and it's a fine line. It's certainly not more than once a month, but it's not less than that either. You want to remain close to the people so that you know what's happening, but not so close that they feel that you are disrupting or questioning their authority or undermining their authority. So my preference generally is to travel and meet the team I work alongside. But of course, I mean, between what we're doing now, Zoom calls and calls and everything else, that's a very effective way of continuing to work. So I don't think that's going to change either.
No, but it's hard, isn't it, on a online compared to a face-to-face where you can gauge people's reactions or feelings, isn't it?
Yes, it's harder to engage, and I think perhaps that's a new skill that interviewees and interviewers will require in the coming years, that they be slightly more in tune with how a conversation goes based on video conferencing as opposed to a face-to-face meeting.
Yes, yeah. I'm really impressed about your ethos and your approach, Rami, and I particularly like your emphasis upon trust, because that's a word that's often abused these days, a little bit like quality in a way. But, so let me just talk about people now. Employees are becoming increasingly alarmed that employers are presently showing a lack of care for them. Redundancy by Zoom. It's called Zoom doom at the moment, seems the vogue. Does Parabellum Investment set a people policy for the companies in which it invests? After all, good talent is rare, isn't it, and needs to be nurtured?
Yes, so we don't have a people policy per se, but we have one by default, and by that I mean the following. Firstly, we're actively involved in the businesses, so we know the people who are active in them. Mm-hmm. Secondly, a lot of the tone and the way in which we engage with employees are going to be driven by the CEO of that business or that company. And so the selection of a CEO is fundamentally important because, as I said, that sets the tone for a whole range of things. I would only recruit someone who is mannered, who treats people with respect. Zoom redundancy may be a necessary evil in the times that we're currently living through, but it really should be exceptional, and ideally, to the extent that it's possible, redundancy should have been withheld or delayed until a face-to-face meeting can be had. But there are important qualities that a leader needs to have, and that isn't just my position as the head of Parabellum Investments, but the CEO of any company involved, any company in the portfolio, forgive me. Those are behaviors, those are CEO behaviors or traits that will drive the people agenda. So it is treating people with respect. It is being considerate. It is being polite. I mean, they're human qualities any more than they are CEO qualities. They're not qualities that one expects of a CEO. They're qualities you expect of a reasonable human being.
Yes, I like that.
Someone with a little bit of empathy for people around them. So if we have to set a people policy to get people to behave properly, then I despair, Malcolm. I don't think it needs to come to that. I think if we choose the right leaders for the business and the right management team for the business, then the right people policy should follow. And if the management team isn't right, then they need to be changed.
I just love your approach. It's very refreshing, and you're obviously a great thinker. But in the supposedly new normal change, this new normal that we're in, most likely the change will come in business culture. What do you think the new business culture, if there's such a thing, of a successful company will look like in the future?
A new business culture. So I thought this one a bit longer than I would have thought, actually. But look, in terms of what I think is going to drive employee behavior in the future, I think it's probably more the point. I think employees are going to be more selective than they might have been in the past about who they work with. So yes. I think it goes without saying that flexible working and all of the implications that has are most definitely here to stay. It might surprise you, Malcolm, but I mean, I know you come across a lot of companies, but there are still a lot of companies that frown upon remote working and flexible working hours. Mm-hmm. I think that's a thing of the past now. I think companies will need to be accommodating to the circumstances of their employees. And if COVID has demonstrated anything, it is certainly that life can carry on and people can do a lot of things remotely without the requirement of being in the office. So the fundamental importance of being accommodating to the employees, and whether it means flexible working, whether it means something else, I think are here to stay. I think that's going to be an important determining criteria when employees choose their employer. In the same way, I think employers will be looking for employees who are self-driven, who are responsible, who don't need to be constantly micromanaged, and who are motivated. Now, one can argue that those qualities and traits are things that employers would have looked for in the past, but I think they've become increasingly important as we come out of this crisis. So the no asshole rule I referred to earlier is probably one that also comes back to mind, I think, more firmly than it might have.
Yeah, I think
because life's too short, and and forgive me for interrupting. Life's too short, and I think I've certainly worked out after 30 years of work that one of the more important things that I enjoy doing is working in a team of like-minded individuals. And there was something I said to myself many years ago, which was I'd rather make less money working with people whose company I enjoy than more money with those whose company I don't enjoy. And I made that mistake at the early days of Parabellum Investments, and I won't be making it again. I think that same thought process will go through the minds of many people in terms of, the culture of the company of the future. Well, it is probably a culture that an employee feels part of.
I think it'll be a little bit like employees will be doing what buyers will be doing. They want to know not what the company does, but what it stands for, what it's about.
Indeed. Yes, what it believes in. Yeah. Whether it attributes value to personal things and people's circumstances. Yeah. So I think companies need to become more humane. Is probably it comes on to one of my wishes later. But okay. I think it's going to drive companies to be a little bit more humane.
Okay. Well, let's find you a potential investing company. Let's picture that a CEO of a company listening to this or hearing it likes what you're saying and wants to talk to you regarding a possible investment by Parabellum Investments. What would you expect that CEO to have at his or her fingertips for that opening meeting with you?
Well, as you'd expect, I would certainly wish the CEO to have their numbers at their fingertips.
Yeah,
and an intimate knowledge of their top 5 or top 10 clients.
Yeah, that's an interesting one.
And an intimate knowledge of their key employees. So who are the employees within the team who are high potential employees and have a career path, whether they've consciously or unconsciously thought about this. I think they're probably the 3 material things that would come to mind first. The fourth one is a bit more nebulous, and it's really about the chemistry of the CEO and whether they feel that they're prepared to work with someone like me and vice versa. I think that the chemistry element is something I mentioned earlier, and I think it's very important, and it's much harder to define. But in terms of three tangible measures, then I think they're the three that I've just said.
Yeah, I thought one of those was really interesting. It was the fact that I know that many CEOs don't know the intimate details of their best clients.
I think you need to always, as a CEO, know your top 5 or 10 clients.
Yeah.
Very, very well.
And get out and meet them, yes. So what are you especially proud about what Parabellum Investments has achieved? Go on, time to be proud.
It's not something I do easily, Malcolm, because my own expectations of Parabellum Investments and myself are higher than where we are today. But I thought about this carefully, and I think the one thing that I'm probably proudest of is that we've achieved a certain level of independence. So we focus on, there are a limited number of deals that we can focus on at any one time, all driven by the available capital to deploy on those deals. But hopefully as the years develop and we make more money, we'll be able to look at not necessarily bigger deals, but probably more of them. So to come back to your question, in terms of thing I'm proudest of, I think it's achieving financial independence in as far as we're deploying our own capital that we've made from the sweat of our brow. Mm-hmm. We're not deploying capital that we have raised from third parties, and I'm sat in a meeting posturing that it's my money, because I've seen lots of private equity firms do that. I understand what a personal guarantee is. I know what it feels like to have your home on the brink. Yeah. And if you can't make payroll, the bank might knock on your door and take everything you own. So I have a lot of sympathy for people who started from nothing, because the only way I could get funding in the early years and later was to give personal guarantees. And I haven't slept well for the last 10 years. And thankfully I'm free of those.
I've been there.
I understand. And you know, you and I
got the t-shirt.
Indeed. But that's something that is hard to understand unless you live through it.
Yes. Yeah.
It's, and putting your own money at risk rather than a third party's money at risk is something else that's hard to understand unless you live through it. I would rather lose my own money than have to explain myself to someone else as to why I lost their money. I think there's some important things in terms of freedom and independence of decision that culminates, I think, what at this stage I'm relatively proud of.
Excellent, thank you. Now then, it's time for your 3 wishes from your fairy godmother, they say. If you have those 3 wishes for the future of the profession of investing, what would they be?
Thank you, Malcolm. Now, I don't wish to sound altruistic, but the 3 wishes are, and it's just something I've been thinking about for a number of years, actually. When I look at the state of society, let's call it investing, or let's call it active investing with a moral compass. So as a number of people become wealthier, there is a disproportionately much larger number of people who are poorer, and I think the current model of capitalism isn't working. I think it needs to be changed, and I'd like the private equity, M&A, investment community, call it what you will, to take a long, hard, introspective look at how we can develop a world of investing that has a moral compass, that has a moral conscience, whether it's, call it what you will, there are lots of different brands for it. But one whereby we live in a slightly more equitable society where you can still do well by taking risks and working hard. But for those that have been disadvantaged through no fault of their own, or that are underprivileged, there needs to be a better and stronger rescue net for those individuals. And I think the investment community has a moral responsibility to do something about this. So that's number 1.
Okay.
Number 2 is a bit more self-serving. Number 2 is in an ideal world, it would be great to have a single consolidated database of of deals, of investment opportunities. I mean,
Yeah.
a lot of my work has come by acquiring firms from larger corporates, larger corporates that have disposed of businesses that are non-core, that they're not entirely sure they want to keep in their portfolio, and they want to sell it to someone who's reputable, who stands by their word, and who will look after the employees and the clients of that firm. So that's one area where I think, you know, we've done rather well and would like that to continue. So that's number two. And then number three, I'd like to make investing far more accessible to the younger generation. And by that, I mean kids all over the world. I know schools in the first world teach children about money and the benefits of investing at a very early stage. But actually, when one thinks about the plight of where we are, and again, back to my first point in terms of the vast number of underprivileged and disadvantaged people and children around the world, being able to help themselves, I think is of fundamental importance. This is something that would take 20 to 30 years to implement. But if children began to think more actively about money and investing from an earlier age, I think it could drive a lot of them out of what could be very difficult circumstances and poverty in the case of many countries. So that's the three.
Excellent. Rami Cassis of Parabellum Investments. I have thoroughly enjoyed meeting you because I'm going away with a right feeling that of integrity, of truth, and that you're a really nice business to work with. Thank you very much indeed for the interview today.
Thank you, Malcolm. It's very kind. Thank you very much.